I think that just as we're living in a nuclear age, we have grown so tremendously in scientific knowledge. It doesn't seem too much to say that men can begin to awaken to the fact that they haven't grown enough spiritually and haven't recognized their spiritual capacities.
Once something like eating is death, then you've struck at the very heart of life. The enemy of the older radical theories may have been the ruling class, but today the stakes of whether we will reform ourselves into a new kind of human being, a new kind of society, whether we will find selves worth being, the stakes of it are simply life itself.
As modernity has created promises that it has no ability to keep. What this means is that we're a society of disembedded individuals, stuck in the impossible situation of being alone together. And what was understood as emancipation has proved to be a form of isolation. It is important to understand that what I am telling you is not simply a cultural history. It's a description of the story that shapes every single person that you know. This is why there is a rise in mental illness. It's absolutely concurrent with the disembedding of the individual, because individuals can't constitute themselves by the very nature of the case. Subjectivity cannot sustain its own weight. We need others to tell us. But we've been given an ethical mandate by the Enlightenment that tells us that that's immoral, that nobody should constrain us.
All right, well, we are back for another episode of Dustbowl Diatribes, and for this episode, we're interviewing Lincoln Rice, who is the author of the definitive collection of the Easy Essays, or the editor. Maurin was the author, as well as Healing the Racial Divide, which is a book about the history of, or a biography on Arthur Falls, who was an early Black Catholic worker, and theological implications to be drawn from his work. I guess that's my introduction. Is there anything you would add to that, or tell us about yourself?
Sure. So yeah, I've been part of the Casa Catholic worker in Milwaukee since 1998, and in 2013 earned my PhD in Christian ethics at Marquette University. And then kind of hot off the presses, a book that just came out that I wrote is The Ethics of Protection, Reimagining Child Welfare in an Anti-Black Society. And that book really came out of the work that our Catholic worker in Milwaukee does, where we have 4 houses, kind of old Victorian houses, and 2 of those are dedicated to providing space for parents who have open child protective services cases. And one of our workers, Amada Morales, actually spends most of her week in children's court providing support for families. So it's just a little bit more background about myself and the Catholic worker I'm associated with.
Cool. Well, and that's probably a good segue to the discussion of your anti-racist work and how you see that fitting in with Catholic workerhood.
Yeah, so it's I guess as a preface, I got involved, or at least for me, anti-racism work came to the fore probably because of Arthur Falls, the focus of my first book, Healing the Racial Divide. He was a Black physician who started the first Catholic worker in Chicago in 1936. And when I came to the Catholic worker in 1998, my room that I moved into, oddly enough, was kind of a repository for books, which was wonderful. And one of them had an article that mentioned Arthur Falls, and I was very intrigued by his Catholic worker that he started, because it wasn't a house of hospitality. He was more intrigued by Peter Maurin's idea of a Catholic worker school, and he started a Catholic worker school, and was actually more opposed to doing hospitality because the school was also an action-oriented school. They had different committees that researched different topics and possible courses of action to address different justice issues. And then they would have weekly roundtables where each group would take turns and there might be some course of action. So I knew a little bit about that, but ended up um, trying to find out more about Falls, and in the process came across his um, his niece, who's passed away now, but she this was probably around 2011. At that point, she was in her 80s, living in Kalamazoo, Michigan, and had a 600-page rough draft memoir that he had wrote sitting in her suitcase in the basement. So it ended up being a great source of what he brought, I think, to the early Catholic worker, though the early Catholic worker was definitely concerned about racial justice issues. The first issue has, I think, maybe even multiple articles that start on the first page that are addressing um, different, either, Black workers who are maybe facing an issue, um, either within that issue or a issue in the very near future that I know they would cover if there had been a lynching and where lynching legislation was. And it was a huge topic in the first few years of the worker. And I feel like that got a little bit put to the side, let's say, especially with the onset of World War II, where I think the Catholic worker was definitely on the defensive because of its pacifist stance and dug itself more in that aspect of itself. And I think that hurt kind of the broader vision that the Catholic worker had for society, because then in its later writings, race is rarely mentioned. And its role in poverty or war or other social justice issues seems to be neglected. It seems to be brought up perhaps as needed if, probably post World War II, the issue of the New York worker where race came to prominence was the issue following the death of Martin Luther King Jr. But all that to say, I feel like the last 10 years or so, I think I'm part of a group of Catholic workers that have realized this is something that's been neglected in our tradition. It goes back to our roots, but it's not something that's been really emphasized. And I think even uh, Dorothy, it was something that was missing in much of her thought. Um, Race barely comes up as an issue in The Long Loneliness. And similarly, in her 1960s book, uh, uh, forgetting the name of it offhand, um, but she wrote kind of you might call it a sequel to The Long Loneliness that talked about the early history of the Catholic worker through the present and kind of her journey there. Um, and oddly enough, there was going to be a chapter on race. The editors didn't want it in the book, and she allowed them to do it. They took it out of the book. But there were other sections that they also wanted her to remove, and she refused. So I think just to, put things in perspective, I'm not trying to say Dorothy Day was racist or Dorothy Day, I think Dorothy Day definitely um, definitely was sympathetic and, did work on behalf of those working for racial justice. But to me, that example with her early 1960s book on the Catholic worker, where she allowed the racism chapter to be excised, but not other parts of it, speaks to where it fell on the hierarchy of importance.
Yeah. Was it loaves and fishes?
Sorry, yes, thank you. Loaves and fishes.
Yeah.
And so, I think especially with Black men who were being murdered either by police or over vigilant people watching over their own neighborhoods. There have been many in the Catholic worker in the last 10, 15 years that have become very interested in this issue. And so I've been very pleased that when I happened to publish the book on Arthur Falls, there seemed to be an audience among Catholic worker folks for it. And oddly enough, I was giving a talk on Arthur Falls last night in Chicago, and to advertise the talk, the group there had borrowed a woodcut that Sarah Fuller had from who had been previously part of the Los Angeles Catholic Workers. She had created a woodcut of Arthur Falls. So, and it's a woodcut of him that has his name and title, and then a quote from him that he would often tell groups if they were perhaps despairing that nothing seems to work or to help. He would let them know that, quote, if you're right, you don't always lose, unquote. So if you're right, you don't always lose. And he really took that from his own experience because he was involved with the Chicago Urban League, then the Catholic Worker Movement. He helped to integrate the hospital system in Chicago, among many other things. And, some of the things that he worked on, he achieved something. Other times he was unsuccessful, and other times he at least prevented the loss of any current ground on the issue. But I think the part of his work that influences me in particular is focusing on a local issue and something with other people of goodwill and seeing what can be accomplished with the gifts and talents of those involved. And so that's where, kind of coming full circle to the book on Child Protective Services, that's become something we've focused on here because it's a issue that we've learned about over the years and been able to be a resource for many of the families that have stayed with us who have had interactions with Child Protective Services. And of course, there's as one would probably expect, an increased not only interaction of Black families with Child Protective Services, but as you see with lots of other problems with racial disproportionality in the United States. It's been true for us, and it's true across the board that Black families are 3 to 4 times more likely to lose their children. So it's we've seen that in practice. It got us into the issue, and now we're trying to, work on that issue with local people who are in different walks of life. And it's something that I feel would be similar to how Arthur Falls would have addressed an issue locally.
Yeah, and like in the biographical section of it, you very much go through like he had these phases, one of which was kind of his Catholic worker phase. And then he just kind of moved on to like where he thought there were opportunities either to learn more or to be a more effective activist, is at least how I read your book. And I guess there's 2 sections I'd especially like to talk about. One would be you suggest in there that he had a somewhat strained relationship with Dorothy because he wasn't doing enough hospitality. But also he was like her surgeon at one point in her life. And I guess, could you expand on that a bit?
Yeah, so they definitely disagreed at times, but it didn't, I don't think it affected the respect that they had for one another, even though they disagreed in their visions for the Catholic worker. Which I guess feels strange to say because one of them, of course, is the founder, a founder of the Catholic worker. But I think that shows how the 30s was this era that, I think a lot of people weren't necessarily afraid, or especially him as someone who was probably born he was born 4 years after Dorothy, so kind of a contemporary of Dorothy, who was a physician. And but yeah, she definitely disagreed with him in not opening a house of hospitality. And one of the times that she visited when she was leaving town, she had 2 of the young, white, impressionable Catholic worker men bring her to the bus station. And before she boarded the bus, she gave them a key. And then she let them know that she had obtained this key from a priest and that she had obtained an apartment for where they could start doing hospitality. So instead of, bringing this up or the key or, she'd been in Milwaukee visiting with the Catholic worker, she had plenty of opportunities to broach it with the whole community. But kind of, I'd say, a little backdoor wheeling and dealing. And I think these young men were interested in a house of hospitality also. They didn't end up using the apartment that Dorothy had obtained, it wasn't a workable situation, but they did then create their own separate Catholic worker, but they stayed in touch with Arthur Falls, and he wasn't one to hold grudges, so he respected that they wanted to branch out and do something different. Um, but it was right around that time period also that Dorothy was passing through Chicago, and she had a infection with an abscess in her throat, and she went to a Catholic hospital that at the time would advertise itself in local Catholic newspapers as a hospital for mothers of the white race. So it was mainly a maternity hospital. And that's where she went. I don't know why she chose that hospital. Maybe it was the nearest one. And they needed to do surgery. And Arthur Falls was a surgeon. And she said, well, I have a surgeon here. And they said, that's fine, have him come over. And then when the sisters saw that the surgeon was black, they're like, well, he can't operate on you. And Dorothy said, well, then I won't be operated on. And I get the sense this was very serious and she could possibly die. And the hospital didn't want to be known as the hospital that Dorothy Day died at. So they relented, but on their paperwork, even though it was Arthur Falls who performed the surgery, according to their paperwork, he was the assistant physician, because they wanted to, at least in their paperwork, say, well, it was led by a white physician, even though that wasn't the truth of the matter.
Gotcha. Well, and partly where that stuck out to me is like in my readings of Day and then just Catholic worker history, I guess I've taken away the idea that she herself was somewhat ambivalent about houses of hospitality. And insofar as she saw them as sort of a stopgap measure to how a true, distributive Catholic, whatever society should be. So it was a little surprising that she would be kind of passive aggressive about it to me. But obviously, you've read more of this. Am I wrong to have been somewhat surprised?
I think, that's a good question. I mean, I do think she felt the heart of the Catholic worker, at least at that time, and perhaps her feelings may have adjusted over the years. But I think the hospitality she viewed as a core aspect to it. I mean, especially after they'd been, during the first year, she had started the paper, but no house, I think their expectation initially was that bishops or some others in the church would start these houses of hospitality, and they didn't. And so in December, during that very cold December of 1933 in New York, she begged and borrowed all the money she could and took some money that was supposed to be for the next printing of the newspaper and opened a house of hospitality. So I think, especially maybe after taking that on as a personal campaign or project, she wanted that to become perhaps the mainstay. And I think you see even early on when the first farms were started, they feel like they also need to do hospitality, which when you add in the fact that they're usually buying whatever they can afford, which means the farmland usually isn't that good. Many of them aren't farmers and don't know what they're doing. And they're trying to do hospitality because they feel like that's part of the essence of the Catholic worker, or perhaps a part that they can't let go even if they're on the land. I think that led to the downfall of most of those early Catholic worker farms and farming communes.
Hi, Lincoln. I just wanted to interject, just to make sure I understand, because I unfortunately kind of got into the middle of the conversation. Are you saying that Maurin was more for the farms and Dorothy was more for the houses of hospitality? Of course, they wanted there to be hospitality in both places, but is that kind of the breakdown?
I don't know if I'd state it exactly that way. Especially early on, I think Dorothy felt the hospitality should be part of any project the Catholic worker is doing, whether it's on the land or not. And for Peter, it was definitely all, his 3-point program of the Green Revolution was roundtable discussions, houses of hospitality, and the farming communes. So for him, they were also integral, but I think he viewed them as separate things, perhaps more than Dorothy did. But I don't know if he would have rated one above the other. I know ex with the great growth of houses of hospitality and kind of perhaps one might say a neglect of the emphasis on the farming communes, he definitely felt there should be more emphasis and more of their resources dedicated to the farming communes. But I think for both of them, it was always just trying to find the right balance. I mean, for Dorothy, I think perhaps one of the strongest, for those who might say, well, she always lived mostly in the city at houses of hospitality, but at the same time, obviously, her whole vision of the Catholic worker rubbed off on her daughter because her daughter mostly lived on the land. So, so I think they were always important, but it was always what's the proper balance.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, and then where that bears on Arthur Falls as well is what do you do when he's doing kind of, I mean, this is kind of anachronistic terms, but when he's sort of doing anti-racist grassroots organizing, that isn't clearly in either of those three programs. So I could see how it could be a little disjunct. And
yeah, he's definitely marrying the first aspect of the program with his previous experience with the Chicago Urban League, because it was definitely a model type that they would have used, but he was then injecting it with certain Catholic worker beliefs. To the best of my knowledge, I don't think he was ever interested in the farming aspect of the Catholic worker, but he was very taken by the cooperative vision. And that first Catholic worker, it wasn't solely a storefront that had roundtable discussions. It actually was, he also started there a credit union. So actually, and I'm not sure how many early Catholic workers actually started their own credit unions, but he did. And then later on, because especially Black residents in Chicago had difficulty, and probably similar to today when you think about it in large cities, there's often these food deserts where you have difficulty finding access to quality food at a reasonable price unless you're going to be going to corner stores where usually there is not good quality food at a reasonable price. And so later on, he also helped found a grocery consumer-owned co-op in Chicago also. So that, the co-op aspect of the Catholic worker movement was definitely something that he held on to.
yeah, he very much reads as what we would now call like a kind of centrist liberal. Like he believed in this is me kind of summarizing how you present it, but when you connect it all, he believed in Enlightenment values, objective truth, the scientific method, especially the social sciences. You talk about that a lot. Yeah, and so he believed in integration and cooperation, and then the other thing I wanted to make sure we talked about, and it flows into this, that he didn't seem to be very interested in civil rights and especially Black power, Black nationalism in the 60s, 70s. Could you talk a bit about that?
Sure. I mean, I think he would have been more critical of the Black Power movement. He would have been supportive of the civil rights movement, but he wasn't active. I mean, he wasn't active with many of the current his contemporary civil rights activities that were happening around him. For instance, during that same time period, that kind of what we think of as perhaps the heyday of the civil rights movement in the late 50s, early 60s, he's working with a group of white and Black doctors in Chicago to make sure that Black candidates who want to be doctors can get into medical school. And then if they actually become a doctor, can they actually be at a hospital? Because at that point, there were about 70 different hospital corporations in the Chicago area, and only 3 of them would hire Black doctors, which also then, of course, limited quality health care for Black residents in Chicago. So from a civil rights perspective, he then was with the black doctors of that group suing almost every hospital, 70 plus hospitals in the Chicago area, and was successful then in obtaining access for black doctors and then hence their patients. And this was kind of concurrent with the civil rights movement. But he, oddly enough, I think his court case, and of course, that'd be something that would make him very different from kind of the more core aspects of the Catholic worker. He's not an anarchist. And so he definitely views the courts as a legitimate method for change, and his court case probably would have been followed and others would have used it, except they came to their agreement with the hospital system and with these different hospital corporations in February of 1964. And it was a few months later in the summer that the Civil Rights Act of 1964 passed, which then essentially made what the hospitals were doing illegal. So that court case then essentially became not necessary from a legal perspective. When it came to the Black Power movements, I think, to use one example, one of the pushes during that time period, which we still see arguments about today, is the use of history regarding, Africa, African American history, which is, I don't remember ever learning anything about Africa or African American history in my high school in Green Bay, Wisconsin. It was still neglected. And, so that was one aspect of needing this type of history to be preserved. And he wasn't against that, but he didn't want it to be the main focus. Yeah, I mean, he himself in the 30s had worked with the Chicago Urban League to make sure that the Chicago's World Fair had a replica cabin of Jean-Baptiste du Sable, who was the first Western settler in Chicago. He was largely being ignored because he happened to be Black. He was also a Black Catholic. So Arthur Falls always liked to quip that the first white man to settle in Chicago was a Black Catholic. So he did value that, but during the late 60s, as he had now kind of opened pathways for African Americans to go into medicine in Chicago and work at hospitals, he now knew that the school system in Chicago wasn't, especially those who were poor, whether white or Black, but usually in more predominantly Black high schools, the education system was failing them, and they weren't competent enough in math and science to get into these medical schools. So he started a program where on the weekends, kids would get kind of paid to come to class if they were interested in going to the medical field, and he and some others would catch them up on what their schools weren't doing in math and science. So I think he always wanted to come from a real practical standpoint, like, well, this isn't necessarily a bad idea, but what will it actually accomplish in, opening doors and opportunities for people?
Was there a clash between him and his friends in the Catholic worker movement over his particular concerns and style, or was that okay?
Oddly enough, I'd say that his way of going about things, I feel, left a more indelible mark on those early group of white Catholic workers than Dorothy and Peter left on them. For example, Ed Marciniak, who's a well-known lay Catholic in the Chicago area, who passed away a few years ago now. But he was one of these, young white Catholics who came and was surprised to show up to a Catholic worker gathering and see that the person who seemed in charge was a Black man. And throughout then his later life, in the 40s, for instance, Arthur Falls had had been badgering Cardinal Stritch to, on the archdiocesan level, create an interracial council that would address the racism that Black Catholics were facing in their own churches. And Stritch was a Southerner who always pushed against it, but in the 40s, he finally relented, formed such a group. He made sure Falls was not on that council, but Ed Marciniak worked his way on there because he wanted to make sure that this issue would move forward. And later on in the 1960s, early 1960s, when Falls was working to desegregate the hospital system, at that point, Ed Marciniak was working for the city of Chicago. Actually, he was the executive director of what they called human relations for the city of Chicago, their Department of Human Relations, which was their term for race relations at the time. And so he was working from the city end of, and they were in contact during this time and both working on this issue together, but from different angles. So I'd say that that's actually quite common with many of these people that were involved with him. And the Catholic Worker also in Chicago, brought a lot of seminarians who were interested in social justice at the time to the Catholic Worker where he was. And it essentially created a generation of Catholic priests in Chicago who were interested in urban ministry and race issues, who then had an influence on race issues in Chicago during the 40s, 50s, and 60s. So it's for Chicago history, he's, I believe, a pretty important figure when it comes to Catholic racial justice.
And so, could you kind of bridge the gap between him and the Catholic worker movement that most people associate of, like protesting Vietnam? Can you jump us from there to like you and the anti-racist debate that's happened in the last decade within the Catholic worker movement?
Yeah, so I think obviously much of the protest work of the Catholic worker movement, I mean, there was protesting during the 30s. They might be having, usually wasn't the type of protesting that would be risking arrest, but there might be signs that were being held outside of some consulate or, and Arthur Falls also inspired by this, but by his own kind of Black heritage. They would be pushing the envelope. They were in the 30s. Their interracial Catholic group might do a sit-in at a local restaurant downtown that wouldn't serve Black customers. But essentially, with their large group of white and Black customers coming in there, it would then prevent anyone else from being able to sit in and order food. And it was their way of pressuring them to start serving Black customers. So there's some I'm not aware of the New York worker or other Catholic workers doing actions like this. It usually is more protesting with a sign. Obviously, Eamon Hennessy, I think, is largely influential and perhaps of bringing in the notion of regularly risking arrest, usually for more of a peace-related issue or anti-war issue. I think those of us who have been interested in the anti-racism work over the last 10 plus years or so, there's perhaps been maybe a little bit of a de-emphasis on the anti-war focus. I'm not aware of any of us being, to the best of my knowledge, most of us are still pacifists and still are anti-war, but it's more that we've feel, or at least I'll speak for myself, I feel that during my first 15 years as a Catholic worker, I was neglecting the issue of racial justice. And so that, and kind of, I'll say, being influenced by people like Arthur Falls, noting that perhaps when I've been looking at peace issues early on, I was regularly arrested in the late 90s and the first decade of the 2000s, probably almost every year at the IRS office, or at a naval base in northern Wisconsin. I was arrested usually at least once a year. But as I got more involved and interested in race issues, I didn't necessarily see that getting arrested was the best way to address the issue. Um, that could change depending on, I'm not saying I'm opposed to getting arrested. It's just, it, in every instance, it doesn't always seem to be the right answer, where beforehand, it always seemed to be the right answer for me. Um, so, now taking the issue of child protective services, it might mean meeting with judges and lawyers and state representatives, which still feels very strange to do as a Catholic worker, because yeah, unlike Falls, I would still consider myself an anarchist. So I'm not meeting with these judges or legislators because I believe that the state is the answer. It's more to try to, similar to what we've seen with prison abolition movement, that some of them will also work on changing certain laws if they believe those laws are leading to the deconstruction of that system. And so I'd take a similar line there, that's how we've worked with the state system here in Milwaukee with the CPS issue. It's not to validate the state, but to try to remove its influence where we see it doing the most harm. And we see that kind of regularly at our House of Hospitality, because that's how I got involved in it in the first place, when Child Protective Services started removing the children of families who are staying with us.
I mean, that sounds practical, and I think you have to deal with the situation as it is, right? And work within the constraints that you have. I think it's occurred to Spencer and I both that like as far as the war protesting goes, it's the war machine and the military industrial complex is so huge, and so the idea that we could influence government in this particular issue seems so remote of a possibility that turning your attention to other issues that you might be able to have some impact on seems like a practical and useful thing to do. And I totally, I don't blame you at all for talking to officials and doing whatever work you can within the system, not because the system's great, but because that's what currently is. And if you don't do that, you're not doing your due diligence, probably.
And for instance, if I told a mother who's just been contacted by CPS, well, don't give any power to the state, don't cooperate at all, depending on her situation, that could just lead to her kids being taken away or her being put in jail. Like, it wouldn't, it's one of those things. I think kind of the tradition in many strands of anarchism, US anarchism, it comes out of a position of white privilege where someone can disengage from interacting with the state and it doesn't have any effect on them. But when the state is actively attacking your family, it's essentially impossible to disengage.
Right. And it holds all the resources, all the power and all the resources. So you can't ignore that. And so, I mean, to be whatever anarchism means, because it's a fluid concept too, to like sort of embrace that philosophically is different from dealing with the practical realities of life. So, I mean, I respect that position. I think a lot of people get uncomfortable because they think that these things are somehow compromises, but this is like what it takes to be effective in the real world, it seems to me. So, yeah, like I know Spencer was asking a little bit about, I guess we were heading in that direction when I kind of derailed us, like the controversies involved in this, like the debate about anti-racism. We do want to have your thoughts about that.
Sure. I mean, there definitely is two minds of this in the Catholic worker. I don't think there's much debate in the Catholic worker that the United States is a country where racism exists and there's a lot of work to do. Where it's become controversial among some Catholic workers and even within certain Catholic worker communities is the notion would it be fair to label Dorothy Day and Peter Maurin as anti-racist? And I would come on the side and say they were not anti-racist. I would say they weren't for racism. I would put them more a term that kind of a middle term that's been created is racial liberalism, where there's this notion to address those gross wrongs, but perhaps not seeing how accurately how racism has kind of inserted itself into almost every issue, every justice issue in the United States. You know, if, for example, I don't think we can talk about poverty or jails or almost any justice issue in the United States without mentioning race. If race isn't brought up, then I think we're probably misunderstanding the issue. And I'd say that's where, you know, during my first 10, 15 years in the worker movement, when I was mainly reading Catholic worker sources and not too many Black sources, I feel like it affected my understanding of the reality of injustice in the United States. I really needed to have that complement of understanding how racism is a part of our fabric of when it comes to housing, medicine, jails, poverty, just every aspect of society. And I think even within communities, then I know of many communities where it's not like some members were saying, hey, you're racist. It was more that they wanted to have internal discussions about how can we make sure that we are conscious of how we might have certain unconscious biases towards Black individuals or Hispanic individuals, and to make sure as a community we're more thoughtful in how we're addressing issues and how race interacts. And those deep conversations that have happened in some communities have led to some very difficult conversations or conversations that have stopped or people leaving communities or because I think there's this thought among some, which I would not be a part of, that would view Dorothy Day and Peter Maurin as essentially perfect on the issue of race. And that the Catholic worker movement, I'd say they treat it more as if the Catholic worker movement were the kingdom of God instead of just an instrument towards working towards the kingdom of God. It's not a heavenly reality. It's just, I think, a good plan and blueprint put down by Peter Maurin to work towards a better reality.
Sure. Well, and I don't understand how, I don't know, maybe I was just too agnostic for large parts of my life, but whenever you're starting from some principle that the founders of our movement or quasi-religious congregation or whatever we are, they didn't have feet of clay. Like, that already seems, you know, before we get into the data, that people should already be on guard against that type of thinking. And maybe maybe it's just too complicated to say that can be true about Maurin and Day, but also they were still good people and they left us a legacy that's important. I don't know. Is that, in your experience, is that just too complicated of a thought?
Hopefully not, but I mean, I will say that I think among white Catholics, Dorothy Day and Peter Maurin were almost as good as you could get during the 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s. But I think it was also true that Dorothy wasn't reading Black authors. I think she started to in the 60s. And it's interesting to look at her writings in the newspaper columns from in the early 60s. She's critical of the civil rights movement critical of the aspect of the civil rights movement that's focusing on court cases and changing laws. But then as the decade continues, it's clear that where in the early 60s, she thought that perhaps by doing things like creating co-ops or kind of other internal mechanisms, the Black community in the United States could negate some of the aspects of racism and flourish. by the end of the 60s, I think she saw that she didn't necessarily think that civil, working in the courts was the way to go, but she saw that what the Catholic worker was doing wasn't necessarily solving these problems either. There's some articles during that time period in the late 60s, early 70s where I read her as almost despairing the issue. It doesn't seem like there's any way forward.
Mm. And this is on my mind, as I'm listening to the history of that we still, as a movement, seem to be largely white. And there does seem to be, regardless of the intentions, which probably are pretty neutral, there just seems to be some sort of barrier where in a lot of places the races just are not mixing, cooperating. And so, you could characterize it as still sort of a white dominated movement that isn't, where that's not at all intentional, I would say, in fact, the opposite probably, but where for whatever reason, just like you see with a lot of churches that are almost completely white, and then we have churches over here that are black and so forth, we don't seem to be able to like take our good intentions and actually find a way to like mix and cooperate together. And so I definitely want your thoughts about that. Like, why is that still so? And what could we do about it?
Mhm. Yeah, I think part of it's a historical notion that the Catholic worker movement is still mostly a Catholic movement. And, we've seen a drop over the last century of the population of Black Catholics. The Catholic Church has not been hospitable. It wasn't during the days of Arthur Falls, and I'd say largely today, it's still not. I've been involved with parishes here in the city of Milwaukee that, were suffering in membership because they were white parishes where they have members either dying or white flight or, but there's even though I wouldn't say they were overtly racist, they feared actually trying to open up their churches to the people that actually make up their neighborhoods now. Um, and so, if someone from the neighborhood goes into many of these mainly white Catholic churches, not just in Milwaukee, but in many places around the country, you're going to have a very European style of worship. Race is probably rarely mentioned. So it's these, I think that's one aspect that the Catholic worker usually attracts Catholics, but if the number of Black Catholics continues to decline, that's going to shrink that pool of candidates. And I know that one reason when I first came to the Milwaukee Catholic worker, almost everyone was Catholic. I think that's been one of the changes that I've probably played a role in myself is I don't think there was ever a thought that you had to be Catholic to join the community, but it was more of the culture of the community. And over the years, because we wanted to be a space where, since most of the workers when I first came were white, almost all of them, and most of the families who stay with us are African American, is there were different African Americans that were interested in joining our community, even if they weren't Catholic or in some cases not religious. We decided to, well, let's see how it works and put them kind of through the same process and we have a 6-month process for joining the community, a 6-month kind of probation, if you want to call it, period. And I found that kind of enriched our discussions as a community. It enriched how it enriched our communal life, but it also added an aspect where now many of the families who stay there just don't see white workers. Our community, I don't know the exact numbers, but it's probably like 40% Black, which is probably, I think, a greater number lower percentage than most Catholic worker communities. And I think it's benefited our house and allowed for, at times, open and more honest conversations among the family staying with us. And I think I say that that's more, I should say, point out that our community does more short-term hospitality for families. I think there can be a difference, some communities do long-term hospitality, some for families, but for single individuals. And there's longer-term hospitality. It allows a greater period of time for people to know each other. In our situation with doing families usually stay with us for 2 to 3 months. So there aren't necessarily close relationships being created, but when you have workers that might look more like some of the families who are staying with us, it allows for kind of easier to build trust at the initial level and to have more open conversations more immediately.
So you found it helpful there. So what do you say to people who say, all of this talk about race is good and very important, but there's this at least as big of an issue and maybe more big issue called like class.
Oh.
And what do you say to those?
I must admit, I thought you were going to say climate.
Well, and that's another big one. But yeah, and like a voice that I found pretty influential on this would be Adolph Reed Jr. And I think to some degree, I think that's probably underlying the tension between Dorothy Day and Peter Maurin, especially Day. Like there was this old left idea that was more common that yes, race is important, but class is how we're going to unite people. Yeah, how would you respond to that? And I guess respond to climate too.
But yeah, with class, I do think Dorothy is coming out of that. And I think, her previous knowledge and interactions with communists and socialists who, communists were as a group, or especially and those who were white communists were probably some of the most dedicated anti-racial,
yeah, you're right about how
some of the most active on the race issue in the United States during the 30s and 40s.
Just real quick, you write about in the book about how Falls didn't like communist ideology, but he saw them as kind of like the gold standard of integrated activism.
He knew that he believed, yeah, exactly. He believed that if he was living in Russia, life would be better for him. He didn't view the Russian system as the way to be, but he knew they were actually interested in the race issue, where the United States and most white Americans were not. But yeah, class, I think, but nonetheless, even with all of that said, class was definitely viewed as the primary issue for many of them, that if you could solve the class issue, everything else would sort of fall into place. And I think Dorothy, on some implicit level, was influenced by that. And I think it led to her neglect for most of her life of realizing how insidious the race issue was. But I think for those who would say, well, we just need to work on class, I think it's, one example that comes to mind is probably because it was definitely formative for me. It was something I remember in the news even as a child during and in high school and going into college, the late 80s and the early 90s, where we have this notion of the welfare queen. Even though the majority of poor people in the United States are white, it disproportionately, poverty affects people of color and Black Americans in particular. But it was, in order to a greater level defund welfare in the United States, politicians needed to paint the typical welfare recipient as Black. And so it's definitely, if the reason that welfare exists in the first place, when it was started as a system in the 30s, it was started because politicians were moved to, at least to some extent, by the poverty of white mothers and mothers who had to give up their children in order to work and support themselves. And so they wanted to make sure that mothers who, whether the father had left or died or whatever the case was, they wanted to make sure to preserve those white families. And the only reason that welfare got passed in the United States at that time, it's somewhat similar to what we saw later on in the 30s with Social Security. It was because of a compromise with Southern states that welfare would be arranged in such a format that they could deny it to Black families. And similar to Social Security later on, it was passed because they made sure that certain groups like farm workers and housekeepers wouldn't be included in Social Security, which, during the 30s, most farm workers in the United States were Black. So they wanted to, they wouldn't have been able to pass that legislation. And even though I don't want to get too caught up in legislation, but I think it does to some extent then reflect the values of the people in this country, on this land, and that they can feel for white people suffering, but if they see Black people benefiting from these same aspects, then it seems more of like, well, maybe they're cheating the system. Maybe we need to be more critical of how we're giving out these funds. To me, that's maybe the primary example to show how these issues, you can't, if you're only talking about class, you're going to have a blind eye to any legislation or any acts of people that are trying to address issues of poverty.
So you almost view it more as like a screen, that if you don't have this framework, you're more likely to I guess complete that thought, if I'm on the right track.
You're more likely to be blinded to real issues of poverty and injustice, because the storyline, of the late 80s and early 90s is the welfare queen is this Black mother that's just sitting at home collecting her checks, maybe even going to college. And of course, now I think, well, why would it be bad if she went to college? Why do we need to, no one cared if the white mothers during the 60s, 70s, and 80s were going to college. But if a Black mother was using this money to go to college, then all of a sudden this was an issue. So there's this double standard that seems to cause a visceral reaction if we associate it with Black recipients. And so I think that the anti-racism work, a large part of it is trying to acknowledge this double standard in our culture. And it's only after we acknowledge that double standard that then we can really say, well, how do we want to address issues of poverty so that everyone has access to the resources and can be a part of the universal destination of goods, etc.
Yeah, like what I'm hearing is that racism is a pretty useful foil to, like, in the shell game, to get white people to focus on Black people rather than on the way in which, the government operates, the economy operates, and so on. Then they can focus on, we just need to get rid of this, the welfare fraud perpetrated by, these people over here. And meanwhile, that the entire problem doesn't get solved. And yeah, I think that that seems reasonable. And it's why you can't totally extricate those two, racism and class. Race and class can't be, because race is so constantly used in this country to divert people's attention away from, what we really ought to get done.
But then it seems to me it cuts both ways as well. So like it can be demagogued in the way that Lincoln is talking about, but it also seems like, I guess to me, a counterexample of how it can be used another way is when people like, not that, I mean, I wasn't really a Bernie supporter because I don't believe in any of these actually existing politicians, but when people like Ta-Nehisi Coates came out and said, well, Bernie's not very good on the reparation question, even though Bernie's talking about giving people better jobs, better wages, access to potentially like better healthcare, the idea that all of that is like insufficiently anti-racist, even though like by definition, if most BIPOC people are poor, then they would benefit, assuming there aren't, like what you talked about with Social Security exclusions. If these policies weren't actively racist or neutrally racist, it just seems to me like the flip side of it is if you don't have a class screen, then the race stuff can be demagogued to basically say middle class and upper class Black people should get preferential treatment, and we're going to ignore poor white people because that's going to be coded as insufficiently not racist. I guess, what do you say? If I'm wrapped in darkness, please.
I mean, I think there's two issues there. One, Coates's, I must admit, I'm not an expert on Coates's politics. So, obviously there are disagreements among different Black groups and individuals if, should there be more emphasis or critique against Republicans, or should the critique be with Democratic? I mean, I think there's often a view of when you have an open Democratic race for president, you want to make sure that race is on their platform. And so you're going to, you don't believe you're going to get race on the platform of the Republican Party, but you might make a little headway maybe with the Democrats. So I'm assuming it has something to do with, it was an election year. They're trying to get it on to get it on the agenda for when he and Hillary were having their debates. But when it comes to if you're neglecting class and focusing perhaps more solely on race, will that then leave poor white people in the lurch? And I get, just to go back to the
majority of pure poor Black people too.
Yeah, but I mean, that's if I go back to the example of, let's say, welfare, if when welfare was cut in the 90s, I believe it was cut because people viewed it as then defunding the welfare queen. But really, it was defunding mostly white people, white poor people. And so if the race issue could be brought to the fore to realize the racism inherent in that policy, and allow, whether it's welfare or some other action or program to address poverty. So, I mean, I guess even when I'm speaking, I'm involving class in it, because if we want to address, like, they go hand in hand, but if when welfare is more open, it's going to obviously also help many poor white people. With the Child Protective Services issue, even though it disproportionately affects Black people, more Black people have their children removed and are, affected by the system. But any change that would bring back that harm, ameliorate that harm, will also, just by definition, help white people, white poor families also. For example, oddly enough, even the rate of Black children is pretty with the statistic that Black children are 3 times more likely to be removed than white children. It doesn't seem to matter if some state is on the low end of removals or on the high end of removals. The disproportionality is a constant. So the state that at least is on the low end of removals is also removing far less white children. So at least when it comes I feel like the issue of poverty and race kind of float and sink together. When there's gains for African Americans, I do think it's in most cases also a gain for whites. I think a similar argument could be made. People that work in disability ethics kind of make a similar argument. Again, it's not, you could find very specific examples where this isn't the case, but generally speaking, when you have greater accessibility for people with, let's just say, certain physical handicaps, like if they're in a wheelchair, um, you know, for instance, having curbs that now have a ramp to get up of. I know when I was a kid growing up in the early 80s, it was kind of when that transition was happening. I grew up on a corner house and it was a curb. If you had a wheelchair, you weren't getting up. You'd have to go around to the next driveway and get up. But, that access for the curb not only helps people who are in wheelchairs, but older people who might be in walkers or people that just have a hard time walking, period. It's when you've increased that access for a certain population, it often then increases access for others.
I think maybe Spencer's got in mind, that when we address race purely without any class consideration, what we sometimes get is just verbiage and maybe some policies that apply mainly to professional people, but not to most people, or that really deal most entirely in the realm of feelings or something like that. And that also is kind of a smokescreen, because those types of things do not affect even affirmative action only affected a very small subsection of people where got applied, females, African Americans, and others, because it just wasn't done. It wasn't. There's no affirmative action for working class people. Almost. I mean, I think I can say that fairly definitively. So, like, and in a lot of cases, when it was implemented in a way that was very superficial to basically be symbolic. And that's where we tend to go if we don't, keep squarely focused on those economic issues at the same time, I feel like.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's always that danger, but it's as long as we're aware of it. I mean, I guess I feel like it's a possible danger, but at least in my work on anti-racism work, I haven't witnessed that problem. I could see it perhaps being more of an issue in politics. Um, I know when I look at like city employment here in the city of Milwaukee, um, obviously, as the city actively started hiring more people of color, that affected working class people of color. When I look at those who are professionals, if I go down to the part of the city where it's all the engineers, they're still almost all white men. If I go to the library, it's still almost all white women. It's oddly, I think the emphasis or the news stories have often focused on the professional aspects of affirmative action, but I guess where I see the greatest gains in affirmative action, it's in places of where the access is easier. Like for instance, Falls knew he had opened these doors for Black doctors to enter the medical system, but there were still all these other barriers, like a proper education to even get into the doors of Northwestern. So, I think in the professional world, it's probably still very difficult to get in, and there's just a very small minority of people of color.
Yeah, you're right, from what I can tell. Um, I have one big question, but I don't know if Spencer, and we're kind of like running down on time, but like, did you have any other questions, Spencer, that you definitely wanted to get to?
I mean, I definitely wanted to ask about kind of my theory through to the extent I've been in the Catholic worker in Kansas City, and obviously you are far more of an authority on this. But it almost seems to me like there's two kinds of Catholic workers that I'm crudely calling Maurinites and Tennesseeites. And Maurinites trying to be like Orthodox Catholics, and usually there's this vision of what reconstructing a Christian social order should look like along kind of distributist anarchistic lines. And there are more what I'm calling Hennesseeites, more named after Amon Hennessy. Even if I'm not saying these people are directly inspired from him. Most of them have never read his stuff, if they've even heard of him. But it is a more rad lib, like they're radical liberals. They believe people should be free. We should work together. We should raise our voice against oppression, protest injustice. And if we're too Catholic, actually, that's kind of weird and creepy and authoritarian. Do you think there's any truth to that? Or again, if I'm wrapped in darkness?
I mean, I would say there's definitely many. I mean, I feel like there are people that I could put into those groups. There's also folks. I mean, when I know I mentioned when I first came to the Milwaukee Catholic Worker, it was almost totally Catholic. But even at that point, I would have said, well, and I probably at that point would have put myself with the Henniosites. And there would have been a few others of us, but I'd say at, at least half, if not more than half of our workers, I don't know if they'd follow too much in either of those. Like most of them are not interested in being arrested. Most of them are not interested in protests. Most of the folks who end up becoming part of our community at Casa Maria are more interested in the house of hospitality and the work that that includes. Um, Maybe some of that is a notion of building a new Christian order. But I'd say they're more attracted to that work and the interactions. It's kind of similar. I mean, Peter, I know in at least one of his essays on houses of hospitality noted that houses of hospitality are give an opportunity for the rich to interact with the poor. And, that is something that is important. And I feel like more so today than in the 1930s, we are segregated not only still by race, but by class. With the highway system and the growth of suburbs, class and racial segregation are much, much greater than they were at that time. And you can essentially avoid interacting with poor people if you already, if you are not poor and you have the ability to afford a home and live in some suburb, you almost never have to interact with the poor, except maybe they're begging your groceries. But if you're keeping it in your own neighborhood, the poor might not even have access to come out there and beg the groceries. It might be high school kids in your area. And so maybe I'm getting off there, but they're definitely, I can think of people who are both, but I feel like there's the majority of Catholic workers that I know are probably more moved by the work and the interactions and the relationships that are being built and are not as interested either from the Hennianite perspective of the anti-war protesting or the Maurinite perspective of the building a new social order. I mean, I think there have been very few Catholic workers over its entire history that have been necessarily moved by that, which I put more as the farming communes. That I often refer to it as Maurin's end game, the village economy that he was trying to move to. It's very rare for me to meet Catholic workers who actually are very interested in moving to a village economy. They're more interested in creating a new social order where for them, I think the new social order would be more of, it might be anarchist, it might not be, but one where there's more relationship building, which hopefully also leads to a decrease in inequality.
Mm-hmm. To me, a lot of it seems like the background is more like social democrat, Christian Democrat. There's something that seems to be kind of their vague background.
Yeah. And I don't know, the Orthodox, I mean, Peter and Dorothy were of a time period that, most Catholics didn't really question most church teachings. And even Peter, if he was around today, would he still would he still be against the use of birth control? I don't know. Obviously, I can't think of too many Catholics in 1935 who were against the church's teaching on birth control. Um, in one sense, it was something so new. That argument was in its infancy, but he definitely disagreed. Or I shouldn't say disagreed, but he saw the core of the Catholic faith and its implications for society very differently than perhaps most bishops in the United States. So I don't know. I always feel strange about orthodoxy. I would have a more, when I hear that Orthodox piety, it seems to me more narrow. I don't know if Peter would have it be so narrow. But that's one of those things. There's no definitive answer. We can argue about it after the fact.
Sure. Yeah, and there's plenty of evidence, there was definitely an ecumenical posture from him and from Dorothy that was held in, at least I read him as held in tension by being a pretty earnestly trying to be within the confines of orthodoxy at that time, which doesn't again, feet of clay.
And I think there are some folks, Catholic workers today, that view the Catholic worker almost as their church. But definitely for Peter and Dorothy, the Catholic worker was not their church. Church was the church. The Catholic worker movement was a social program. And that's why Peter could bring in people who weren't Catholic or sometimes interact with, people of all different backgrounds, or at least initially be inviting them to roundtable discussions when he thought they were, initially when he thought these would be monthly ordeals that would bring hundreds of people, which didn't turn out that way. But he was hoping it wouldn't just be Catholics. He wanted this to be a program that brought more people together. I think the reality was it mainly only attracted Catholics. So some Catholic workers became perhaps what might be termed as semi-monastic, with regular prayers. And I mean, obviously, Peter's initial vision in the early 30s, writing on houses of hospitality, didn't include evening liturgy of the hours, because they were just hoping the bishops would do it. He never got that detailed in his blueprints, and he never wanted to get too detailed, because he always, as he stated, when people pushed him for details, he wanted to make sure there was room for adaptation and changing situations.
Sure.
Makes sense.
And to some extent, the fact that, there's this umbrella where there are Maurinites, maybe we call the people you're talking about Dayites. Again, we're being crude and loose and using these people like archetypes.
Yeah.
Like the fact that all these people can still more or less identify as Catholic workers seems to me pretty clearly a legacy of that ecumenical posture.
Definitely.
Yeah. Well, I have one question for you, big one. So, and you can take a pass on this if you want, but if you could change one thing at the national level, in our economy or government, and you could change one thing in the Catholic worker movement, what are those things?
Initially, these things might seem to contradict one another, but on the national level, if I could say there'd be one policy that'd be put in place tomorrow, it would be for the guaranteed income. I just think of all the families that have come through Casa Maria that, in Wisconsin, we call it the welfare to work program, and they need to be putting in all these hours while their kids are in daycare, and they're getting $650 a month, which if they're putting in all their hours at their work training placement, they might be making technically like $5 an hour. So it just seems like the total wrong way to support. Again, I think it's because of the notion of the welfare queen that this hideous form of welfare now exists in the United States. It would eliminate welfare. It would eliminate the need for all these middle people who make money off of enacting these programs. And I think it would also permit people, I think there might be other people that would be interested in doing something like the Catholic worker or even trying to start a Catholic worker farming commune that are very afraid to take that leap because it's a leap into uncertainty, perhaps giving up a job that they don't know if they'll be able to get back if they can't make a go of it and lose the land or can't make the rent or uh, um, the payments for it. And so I think it would allow um, for perhaps a greater opportunity for trying out Peter's vision of distributism. Peter was probably more unique among the distributists with his anarchy. I mean, I'll say he's an anarchist, even though he never called himself one. Dorothy said he was one. Um, but I think one of the arguments to say that Peter was an anarchist is that he never pushed for any legislation to help distributism come into place, where the English distributists that he adored so fondly, they were pushing for legislation that would allow people to actually go back to the land and survive. Because if you're trying to create things, but Walmart exists. I mean, we'll just say now, if now you want to do something on the land and you're doing some arts and crafts and trying to survive on that, people who have money can afford it, but if someone else wants to buy a basket, well, they can buy a basket for $2 at Walmart. Why would they pay you $20 or more for your very nice basket? But if there was something like a guaranteed income, I think it would allow for a possible movement to a distributed society. Maybe then the guaranteed income wouldn't be needed anymore. I think a lot of people would quit jobs at Walmart, McDonald's. It would defund, it would make these jobs much more difficult to place. So that would be for on the US level. Among the Catholic worker movement, um, I don't know. I know maybe just more regular national gatherings. I think the ability of people, different Catholic workers, to get together is really helpful. As I mentioned earlier, many of the people that have been in the Milwaukee worker over the years are just more interested in the work, and I feel there's a disconnect from the greater movement. But that's been one of the blessings of having Sugar Creek, as we call it, our Midwest Catholic worker gathering, when I can get a few of those folks and drag them with me to the Midwest Catholic worker gathering. It really, I think, helps them see that this is part of something bigger. And if people then get interested, I think that often is the true stepping stone for some folks to dive more into Peter Maurin and Dorothy Day when they see how other people are doing this work in different ways and how meaningful it is for them in their lives. Just that getting together, I feel, is very important.
Wow, those are both good ideas. I do basically agree on that basic income too. I mean, it's not the ideal solution, but I think it would go a long way and it would definitely shake things up. I agree with that. Because basically what we have now with welfare to work is subsidized low wage labor for corporations and put off into this guise of we don't want people to be lazy, but actually we're just like making them work at substandard pay, because that's what keeps our economy going. So yeah, I agree. Yeah, I mean, in a way, we're trying to be this kind of like in the Maurin Academy, we're trying to be this point of contact with Catholic workers. Um, and so we're always, we're hoping that some of the folks will hear this and some of the other things we've done. And we're doing a roundtable pretty soon at the end of January. It is online, which I know is not exactly totally perfect, but we're going to do that twice a year. And then a lot of our courses are also basically some kind of round table. So hopefully in our own way, we're kind of contributing to that because it is a very far-flung movement and it really helps to have these conversations like we're having here. So
Yeah. Yeah, and I agree. I think, a more openness to doing a few things online, not that it is everything we do, but I feel it's been so helpful. Shortly after the beginning of COVID, there was an online National Catholic Worker Gathering, and it was a great I mean, I remember they just had like one computer set up in the kitchen of the Los Angeles Catholic Worker, and we could see there were like 10 of them there together in the room, all around one computer together. And it was, during that time of isolation, or it's just so great to be with other folks, but also what you're doing allows for people that to get together from different parts of the country on a somewhat regular basis that wouldn't be able to. So I think it definitely is a good complement to the Catholic worker movement.
yeah, we're hoping so.
Well, thank you, and thank you for coming on for this interview.
Yeah, thank you. It was a pleasure to be here. Very good to meet you, Spencer and Laurie.